Let me begin by saying this is a fantastic meeting. I really have enjoyed every minute of it, and I'm so impressed with NTNU and their ability to put a meeting together. I want to start off with talking to you about this project, which we call the Implications of Paris Research and Workshop Series. And yesterday we spent 10 hours of probably the most intense time that I've spent in a long time, talking about what the research agenda is going forward, particularly in regard to the role of the sectors. And so many of the topics that came up during the course of the day, we came up yesterday as well. I'll say that there is a connection back to Norway that this project has, because it was originally an idea that emerged before the Paris Agreement. And going into the Paris Agreement, there was an enormous amount of work that was undertaken, almost as if there was never going to be any more work needed, that what we needed to do was just get the information necessary to put together this accord. Now, I'd lived through the Framework Convention on Climate Change, I'd lived through the Berlin Mandate, I've lived through the creation of the Kyoto Protocol, I'd lived through the creation of the Copenhagen Accord. And I was pretty sure that after the Paris Agreement, there would still be some questions left on the table, and the Paris Agreement didn't disappoint. The Paris Agreement left as exercises to the reader a number of different questions that I just cite 4 of them here that include, well, it uses nationally determined contributions. These are what the outcome that the participating governments would like to see, but it doesn't tell you how you're going to get there from here. And so it left as an exercise to the reader the whole process of figuring out, how do you get there from here? How do you implement, how do you achieve the goal that you set forward in your nationally determined contribution? Article 6. Article 6 says that countries can jointly implement their NDCs. That's really good, but it didn't really talk through the process by which you improve the performance of a peak year goal by marrying it up to an emissions per unit baseline GDP. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done to take Article 6 from, it'd be really great if we could actually get the gains to trade that economists talk about, but how do you do that? Third example is there is to be a global stocktake in 2023, and thanks to the Marrakesh, we have Global Stocktake Junior in 2018. It really doesn't explain what a global stocktake is, how you do one, what needs to happen, and when. And then they threw in a really interesting sort of twist at the end, and that is the new goal is well below 2 degrees. 1.5 if you can do it. And they did that at a time when there was no comprehensive analysis that showed that you could put together a pathway that led to 1.5 degrees. And so there was plenty that was left on the table. So in preparation for this, we began putting together a project which we, as I said, we call the Implications of Paris Research and Workshop. And it basically has 2 pieces to it. We try to do high priority research to fill gaps that have been identified and to understand what it is that needs to be the research that needs to be developed to inform the process going forward. And then it conducts workshops, and the workshops have 2 functions. The original workshop, being the first, met this test of identifying what some of the research gaps were, and then as we move forward and conducting research, bringing that research back to the community and to decision makers in a way that makes them aware of what the cutting edge is, but also comes back and asks, what's the new frontier? And so we had a first workshop that went back, that was conducted last May, 3 and 4 at the University of Maryland. It then fed into the Climate Action 2016, which was this much bigger meeting that was the UN meeting, but it had a feed-in process that brought that information to a much larger community. What came out of that was a research agenda that really, while a group of the size of the group that met in Maryland, which was 44 individuals that were really very knowledgeable, and they were drawn from 5 different communities. They were drawn from the research community. They were drawn from the governments. They were drawn from the private sector, from NGOs, and from the finance community. That group of people, many of whom, and I think one of the contributions of this activity is that it brings together people who don't normally meet together to discuss what is it that we need to know and how do we go about the process of learning it. It identified 4 broad research questions, which were how will national circumstances, institutions, and goals influence the implementation of the NDCs, and what are their emissions implications of the choices that are made at national, regional, and local levels? How can international institutions make the NDCs more effective? What are the best measures of progress toward the long-term objectives of the global stocktake? Can sustainable development goals be achieved simultaneously with the goals of the Paris Agreement? We've heard this coming up over and over again during the course of the day. And what role will technology and control of non-energy-related emissions play in achieving the NDCs and the long-term goals? So one of the pieces of research that comes out of this is a paper that was published in Science, and it looked at the question of, well, what do you get if you implement these nationally determined contributions? And the answer to that was, I think, its contribution lay not in the fact that it went through and did the exercise of figuring out what does it mean in terms of emissions and then translating that into atmospheric composition, but rather it actually framed up the benefit of these NDCs in a risk management context so that we explored the implications of doing the Paris Agreement, or at least the NDCs that were at that time available, and then the benefits from increased ambition. And so you see at the very top your classic reference scenario and the relative probabilities of different outcomes, and you'll notice that well, in the reference scenario, there is no probability that you will limit climate change to 2 degrees at the end of the century. That even if you follow an alternative reference scenario in which in the year 2030 you do something that looks kind of like the NDCs and continue that along indefinitely into the future, you do a little bit better, but that world really doesn't have a 2-degree potential. The third, which was implementing successfully the NDCs and then continuing that level of ambition forward into the future, which has the consequence of roughly stabilizing the emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and it's emissions that are stabilized, not the concentration, because as we all know, the accumulation of carbon, ultimately there is, at least on a 1,000-year time scale, a irreducible fraction of that carbon that will remain in the atmosphere in year 1,000. And so it stabilizes emissions. That means at the end of the century, the concentrations are still rising. Even so, you open up the possibility, small as it may be, roughly less than 10%, that the world will have a temperature of 2 degrees or less. And you have reduced the likelihood that the average temperature of the surface of the planet is greater than 4 degrees to less than 10%. But if you increase the ambition, this analysis, to roughly double the rate that countries have signed up to in their NDCs, that the door is finally opened at least to some possibility that you could stabilize at, or you could end the century at 1.5 degrees, and you've almost eliminated the likelihood that global average surface temperature change will be above 4 degrees. And so that's an example of some of the research that has come out of this activity. Here in Trondheim, we held the second of this series of workshops. The goal of this workshop was to identify the research needed to better understand the role of the sectors. And we had two important considerations, and they are: what are the technical and technological requirements? And then secondarily, what are the policies, measures, and new business models that will be needed to achieve the near-term and long-term goals of the Paris Agreement? And I think what is unique about this is that I've been to dozens of meetings that have looked at the technical and technological meeting, and similar numbers that are worried about how do you implement policies and measures, but actually getting those two communities together to work on the research agenda that is the joint research agenda, I think was, to my mind, one of the most stimulating parts of the activity. If you look at the models, you will see that the role of the sectors is sort of laid out, at least in terms of the models. These are the results that Volker reported, and they include number one, energy efficiency, reduce the demand for energy as much as is economically possible, decarbonize the power sector, and there are lots of technologies. And I guess if I look at the literature, I come down on the side that there is no technology that is so critical that you can't pull it out of the mix and still reach your goal. That doesn't mean that it's the least cost after you've done that, but it does mean that you could still get there from here, electrify buildings and industry as much as economical, then decarbonize the transport sector. And we've seen here today that is pretty much an uncertain or at least a foggy future as to whether or not the transportation sector will be dominated by electricity, biofuels, or hydrogen, and how that couples back to the rest of the system. And then finally, the element that is never on the table, it is really probably as important as any of these other individual elements, and that is you need to halt deforestation or increase forests and continue to improve crop yields, because if you don't do that, you're never going to get here. And that is, there is no road to 2 degrees that doesn't fundamentally change the footprint of humans on the landscape. If there is CO2 capture and storage available in the mix, the models all tend to like to have bioenergy with CO2 capture and storage, and they go, and that's how they get their negative emissions. But there's always negative emissions. In all the pathways to 2 degrees, there's always negative emissions. The alternative is pull CO2 capture and storage out of the mix. We're never going to do that. And then ask, where's the negative emissions going to come from? And the negative emissions are required because there are emissions from non-CO2 greenhouse gases and some technological processes that are just fundamentally difficult to pull out of the system. And I think that that's probably one of the most important things that is ubiquitous across the models, and yet is really, really poorly understood by just about anybody else that's outside the modeling community. Then I threw in at the bottom here this question: what's the business model for either of these propositions? And I think that's a really interesting question, and I think that's one we need to be working on fairly aggressively. This is a reanalysis done by Volker Cray that he showed, in which he took those same data that produced the global aggregates and pulled out the regional components of them and showed that, in fact, you actually do have different patterns. So note the difference in scale between India and the European Union. You have different patterns in the role of the sectors. While they are similar in shape, they are actually different in magnitude. The conversation included a conversation on electric power production, what's the role of power sector in the near term and in the long term, and what are the technology developments and the policies and measures. And much of the conversation we had here, and similarly we had a conversation around technology. We then moved into a session which was really about how do you get there from here, which was green competitiveness under a diverse policy and market system, and looked at new business models that might be needed and how we can create potentially, or at least we raised the questions around how to create a coherent bottom-up approach to meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement and taking into account the potential conflicts between national, international, local, and regional policies and the need to get those communities together. I'm going to finish on a slide that Jennifer Lakey, who you've already heard from, put up, and I thought it was really a nice slide because it actually captured a lot in some of the same ways that slide I put up about how do the models technically get to their goals, actually put up in a sense a similar pathway. What are the characteristics that are required to meet a disposition of emissions mitigation activities? And it begins with start with the stakeholders and engage them. Start with the people who are going to be making the decisions, and you need to work with them because they're going to have needs and requirements that are absolutely essential. And then she goes on in that same slide to establish a stable enabling environment to align with fiscal incentives, to use strategically public resources to mobilize investment, to invest in technology and innovation, and to use innovative financial instruments and arrangements, as well as learn and then take that learning forward. So with that, I thank you for your time, and congratulations on a great meeting.